Well, the project begins in chapter 3. Reconstruction began during the festivals of the 7th month. Now, there are 3 festivals in the 7th month for the Jewish calendar. There's the ritual blowing of trumpets, there is the Day of Atonement, and then there is the Feast of Sukkot. The ritual blowing of trumpets is a festival that is a one-day festival. And later in Israelite history, this also becomes the New Year day, called Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. We're not sure exactly when the Israelites changed their New Year from the first month, which would have been going back to the Exodus in the first month of Aviv, to the 7th month. But at some point they did, and most scholars think it's likely that that change happened during the Babylonian captivity, because the 7th month New Year is more typical of the Mesopotamians. In any case, the first of the festivals, the blowing of trumpets and Rosh Hashanah, would have been in the early part of the 7th month. The Day of Atonement, on the other hand, is the day when the high priest went into the most holy place one day a year on Yom Kippur, and there he would offer blood for himself and also for the sins of the whole nation. And then finally there is the week-long festival of Sukkot, usually in English Bibles called the Feast of Tabernacles. And this particular festival lasts for 7 days, with the children and the families camping out, cooking over an open fire, living in a brush booth as a way of commemorating the sojourn in the desert and their deliverance by God. If Rosh Hashanah was being celebrated as the New Year in the 7th month, at least by this time, then the project of laying the foundation of the altar begins in the same month that Ezekiel saw his vision of the new temple. Because if you go back to Ezekiel chapter 40 and verse 1, it does say that Ezekiel had this vision at the beginning of the year, and that would be like the New Year, or Rosh Hashanah. So that's a really kind of interesting possible connection to be made there. This shows the Jewish months and their corresponding English months. You'll see they don't correspond quite the same, because the Jewish calendar is made of 30-day months, 12 months long, but that of course brings you up a little short to a solar year. But the Jewish months are based on a lunar year. And so it's a little different than our modern calendar. The season of the 7th month happens in the month of Tishri. And you'll see on this chart under the festivals, you'll see Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. These are the festivals of the 7th month when they begin to build the great altar. We don't know exactly what the great altar looked like, but here are a couple of examples of Israelite altars that might help us. One of these was excavated in Be'er Sheva in about the 8th century, or from about the 8th century BC. And you will notice this is a 4-horned altar made of cut stones. The altar on the right is a solid piece of stone. This is a 4-horned altar that was excavated at Tel Dan and goes back to about the 9th century BC. Now, in the book of Exodus, there is a very specific instruction that says the Israelites are not to build their altars out of cut stone or quarried stone. The altars that you see in these 2 depictions, in fact, are made from quarried stone or cut stone. So we're not sure that the altar that they built for the Second Temple was exactly like these altars, but even if it was made of uncut stones, which is the way the book of Exodus specifies, it still probably would have looked somewhat similar to these 2 4-horned altars. The one thing that really is important with the rebuilding of the altar is that now the daily sacrifice can be resumed. There are sacrifices in the morning and in the evening. This is called the Tamid, and this establishes continuity with the past. Once the Jews are able to offer the morning and the evening sacrifice, they now have a link with all of those hundreds and hundreds of years in which priests going all the way back to Aaron have sacrificed the Tamid in the morning and in the evening. These sacrifices also would allow them to celebrate the annual festivals, the new moons, various kinds of things in the Jewish calendar now could be reinforced by this historical link with the building of the great altar. And they begin to stockpile materials for the construction. Finally, they laid the foundation of the Second Temple in the 2nd year of their return, as it describes in chapter 3. When the foundation is laid for the second temple, there's a great celebration staged with priests and choirs and orchestras, and it's very much like David prescribed for the first temple. So this is a really exciting time. The foundation has been laid. They are off the ground. They're getting started here, and it was a cause for both joy and disappointment. As you read it in the book of Ezra, it says that there were those who were shouting for joy and those who were weeping. And it's interesting that it is the old people who are weeping. The old people were the people who actually saw the first temple before it was destroyed. They were residents of Jerusalem. They saw the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. Then they were taken to exile all the way to Babylon. They lived there for several decades. Now, as old people, they have come back and they have looked at the foundation of the second temple that is being built. And according to Haggai chapter 2, verse 3, they didn't think much of it. They thought, wow, this isn't that great. We thought this was going to be so great. It's not that great. But all the young people are shouting for joy. They're excited. It's the beginning of a new thing for them. So you have this mixture of emotions. Now, when we get to chapter 4 of Ezra, it is really, really important to distinguish that there is a middle section of this chapter that is not chronological. You can read verses 1 through 5, and then that part of the story does not pick up until chapter 4, verse 24. So between verse 5 and verse 24 is this long section, which is kind of like a parenthetical section. And so when you come to the end of that parenthetical section, you need to recognize that when you move from verse 23 to verse 24, you have jumped over a chronology problem. So it's really critically important to realize that this narrative about intermediate events and oppositions is an insertion into the larger story, and it does not follow chronologically. Otherwise, you'll end up with some severe historical anachronisms. So just keep that in mind as you read this. The first part, chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, begins in 536 BC. Then you have this intervening period in which there is the parentheses of events of things that were oppositions to the people of Israel, and then eventually in chapter 4, verse 24, you pick up the story again. So really, if you're reading this as a narrative, you should go from verse 5 directly to verse 24. That will keep the narrative in sequence, and then the in-between part you would read separately. So here's a summary of the kind of things that arose against the people. First of all, the fact that they were building a new temple is not a happy thing for the locals. People who have been living in Jerusalem during the exile of the Jews, they're not happy to see the Jews return, and they're not happy to see the Jews rebuilding their temple. And so they are going to offer a lot of resistance, a lot of criticism, a lot of discouragement, and in some cases outright threats to the people who are building the temple. So this is described in the first few verses of chapter 4. They harass the community, they intimidate them, and this is going to happen over the next 16 years. After the foundation was finished, the intimidation became so strong that the Jews simply quit working on the temple. And they quit working for 16 years before they would go back and finish up again. So the account of the temple's reconstruction breaks off then at verse 5 in chapter 4. And it won't resume until chapter 4, verse 24. And that long parenthesis is described in between. So here's kind of the chronology. 539, Cyrus gives his edict that the Jews can return and rebuild. 538, the Jews gather themselves together under the leadership of Sheshbazzar, and they go back to Jerusalem. 537, the great altar is constructed in the second year of their return. Now they can begin offering sacrifice in the morning and the evening. But then in 536, the temple work begins, they lay the foundation, but then the work is suspended. And the work will be suspended during the reigns, the remaining years of the reign of Cyrus, during the relatively short reign of Cambyses, and into the second year of the reign of Darius I. So it's going to be 16 years before they pick up with this again. Finally, in 520 BC, the work is resumed in chapter 4, verse 24 of Ezra. And that should be coordinated with the very first verse of the book of Haggai. Now, this parenthesis I talked about that's kind of in the middle of chapter 4, it describes several things. It describes something that happened in the period of Xerxes, which would be in the 480s to the 460s. Some kind of accusation was made against the Jews, and we don't really know what it was about. There's no detail given. It might be related to the book of Esther. At least the name Ahasuerus, which is a Hebrew transliteration of an old Persian name, is the same as Xerxes, so it could be related to the book of Esther, but we're not sure. Then, during the period of Artaxerxes I, there was a formal complaint lodged by Persian officials against the rebuilding project. And so this is the long section in Aramaic that begins in chapter 4 and verse 7. And it records the complaint of these peoples, which went back to the Persian leaders. And this also issued a halt to the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Here, in fact, is a bas-relief of Xerxes I, which was excavated in Persepolis, and it is in the Tehran Museum in Iran. You will see that Xerxes is displayed in the typical Persian posture. He is sitting on a quite elaborate throne with a footstool. In fact, all of the ancient depictions of monarchs usually have them with a footstool. It kind of reminds you of Psalm 110, where the Lord's Messiah will reign until all enemies are a footstool under his feet. He has the staff of authority, and in his hand he holds a lotus. Then he's approached by a courtier who has his hand over his mouth. That's also very symbolic in Persian bas-reliefs. When you approach the king, you don't talk, you let him talk, and you only speak if he allows you to speak. So you come in basically in silence. You'll see a couple of interesting artifacts between Xerxes and the courtier. These kind of spindly looking things with a conical top. These are actually incense burners. These are to keep the throne room smelling nice. Now, in the ancient world, well, quite frankly, they didn't use deodorant and all the kinds of things that we're more accustomed to in the modern world. So incense burners were ways of masking odors that were unpleasant. So in many of the bas-reliefs of Persian leaders, you will see these two little things in there as well. Well, 16 years is a long time, this hiatus between verse 5 and verse 24. And during this time, the people who returned experienced a whole series of drought and crop failures. In fact, if you read the book of Haggai, you find that it is a difficult time. It is a very, very difficult time. Zechariah calls it a day of small things, and Haggai says it's a time of disillusionment. And so during this time, there's continued antagonism from the locals. Their wheat is not growing, their corn is not growing, there's no rain. It's just a really, really difficult time. But it's during this time, near the end of this 16 years, that there are two voices that begin to speak clearly. And those two voices are the voices of two preachers by the name of Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai, and we know what he preached to them because we actually have his sermons in the book by his name. He chided the people for spending time in their own homes more than on the temple. And he encouraged them by promising that God's glory would in fact return. They needed to be about the business of building the temple because that was part of the process by which the glory of God would return. And in fact, Haggai said the glory of the second temple would be even greater than the glory of the first temple. And he assured them that if they would build the temple, they would have a part in what God was doing in his long-range plan. Zechariah, in a similar way, said that God was eager for the reconstruction of the temple, and he was very angry at those who were intimidating the Jews. He promised that they would be prosperous if they would rebuild the temple, and he urged that the project would be a success because it would be empowered by the Holy Spirit. He predicted that Zerubbabel, the one who was responsible for laying the foundation 16 years earlier, would actually be the one to place the capstone in the building and say, "It is now done." So the same leader would be there for both the beginning and the end of the temple project. And so the future was bright with promise, if only they would get back to work and begin rebuilding the temple. And so with this encouragement from Haggai and Zechariah, Zerubbabel, Joshua, all the people came together enthusiastically, and they once again resumed work on the temple. Now, they still had to face opposition. There was an archival search of Cyrus' permission document that had to be found and validated, and that was done. They went through the processes that was necessary in the Persian Empire. And when a record of the original decree of Cyrus was actually discovered in Ecbatana, that's where Cyrus spent his first year after the destruction of Babylon, Darius, who was now the emperor, not only gave them permission to continue the work, but surprisingly enough, he ordered the governor of the Trans-Euphrates province to pay for the construction expenses and to provide animals for sacrifice. Well, that was a surprise. I don't think anybody was expecting that, and I'm sure that the Jews were absolutely elated and the locals were chagrined because now they had been trying to discourage the Jews from rebuilding this temple. Now not only do the Jews have full permission from the emperor to do it, the locals now have to pay for it. And so the Jews are really probably pretty excited at this point as they begin. And this is Darius the Great, who in his second year researched the archives for the decree of Cyrus and discovered it. And so he authorized the returning Jews to begin building work on the temple again. Again, you'll see that stylistically, Darius is depicted very much like Xerxes was. He has the lotus in his hand, he's got the staff in his hand, he sits on a very elaborate throne with a footstool and so forth. These are the remains of the audience hall of Darius the Great at Persepolis. A number of the sites of ancient Persia have been excavated by archaeologists. And so this one was quite an elaborate audience hall. The tablets that were found within this excavation actually name Darius and Xerxes by name as the builders of this palace. This is Darius' residential palace at Persepolis. It was built in about 515. And you can also see from the picture that it is quite elaborate. This is a scene also from Persepolis that shows Darius seated on the throne. He's the one who is the emperor in this visual depiction. And then right behind the throne, to the left of this bas-relief, will be Xerxes, which will be the crown prince. And then, as was described earlier, there are courtiers that are coming before the emperor, the one with his hand over his mouth, and you see the two incense burners that are in this depiction as well. Well, they worked on the temple, they got together until the second temple was completed, and it is completed in 516 BC. They finally finished it. The new edifice was dedicated, the priests were installed in office for temple service. They offered 12 male goats, as it says in the book of Ezra, according to the tribes of Israel. Now that's an interesting point, because at this stage in their history, there aren't really 12 tribes, at least in the old sense of the word. The northern tribes have gone into exile by Assyria, and they have never come back. The only thing that is left of those northern tribes would be refugees that fled south to Jerusalem and then became included in the body of Jerusalem residents that eventually were exiled to Babylon and now have come back. But in spite of the fact that those northern clans no longer exist in the former way, they don't have any land territory like they used to have, still they're going to offer 12 male goats. They want to keep sacred this number 12 because this is the number of the tribes of Israel. And now that the temple is completed, it has been exactly 70 years since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple. So that may be the answer to the 70 years predicted by Jeremiah. The project is completed in the month of Adar, which is the last month of the year, and then that brings us right over into the first month of the new year where they celebrate the Passover. And so this was no doubt a really gala event when they celebrate the Passover in 515. Now we move to the last section of the book of Ezra, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10. This section will actually describe the coming of Ezra to Jerusalem. And this, as I mentioned earlier, this is the second wave of people coming to Jerusalem. The first wave was with Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel. The second wave is now with Ezra. There will be, in fact, a third wave that will be with Nehemiah, but the rest of the book of Ezra at least, is about this second wave of those coming back with Ezra. Now this happens about a half a century later. So in chapter 7 and verse 1 of Ezra, when you read this passage, it's going to just say simply, "Now after this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, Ezra is going to be the one who's going to lead this second wave back." Of course, without any markers, we wouldn't know how long this was, but in fact, because it mentions specifically the reign of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, we know this is about a half a century later. So the word "after this" doesn't mean like a few days later, this means a half a century later. So a long time has now passed between the completion of the Second Temple in 516 and this period in the 400s when Ezra is going to come back. The temple was completed in 516, but Artaxerxes' reign begins in 464 and takes us all the way down to 458 BC in chapter 7 and verse 8. So we are quite a long time now later than the rebuilding of the temple under the first leaders. The early leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua, and the prophets Haggai and Zechariah are now presumably dead. We don't know that for sure, but their names are no longer mentioned, and so we're presuming that by this time they have died. If the oracles of Malachi are from about the same time as Ezra chapter 7, which we think they probably were, then this would seem to suggest that the community has fallen into a state of spiritual disillusionment. There seems to be a lot of cynicism. There is hostility toward God. As you read the passages in Malachi, Malachi seems to indicate that there was a real attitude that was cynical toward God, hostile toward God, and toward the community. And so this seems to be a difficult time, and Ezra is going to arrive in Jerusalem at just the right time to sort of set things straight. Ezra is a priest. He comes with an impeccable pedigree. He can trace his lineage back all the way back through the history of Israel and the priesthood. And he gains permission from Artaxerxes to lead another group from Babylon on this trip to Jerusalem that takes about 4 months to travel. Ezra is the supreme example of the good teaching priest. Now, often we think of the word teacher more in connection with the New Testament, but in fact, in the Old Testament, it was primarily priests who were the teachers of the people, and they did their teaching on the great festivals like Passover, or the Festival of Weeks, or the Festival of Sukkot. And Ezra is one of these teaching priests. He is going to be given a letter of official authority from the emperor, Artaxerxes, which is actually in Aramaic. And he's going to bring with him a lot of people who are going to come back from Babylon to Jerusalem. And Ezra is going to now teach the people when he arrives. Permission was granted for as many people as wanted to accompany Ezra. They could, and so quite a number of did. The emperor gave him a grant from state funds for sacrifices. He also provided him with a document to the governor of the Trans-Euphrates region so that he could get supplies. He even granted him exemption from taxes. How good is that? He gave him the authority to set up a judicial system so that when he got to Jerusalem, they would not have to rely upon a judicial system from the local Persians, but he could set up his own judicial system that would be in alignment with the law of Moses, and he could appoint civil magistrates for enforcement. So when Ezra comes back, he comes back with a lot of really good advantages. This is Artaxerxes I. This is the one who gave Ezra permission to come, and you can see he is in the typical stylistic posture of the Persian emperors. He is sitting on a throne, he has a footstool, he has the pleated robe that is quite important, he holds the staff in his hand, and behind him there is a servant who is wielding a fly whisk to keep flies off of the royal person. Sounds a little funny for us today, but in the ancient world they didn't have pest control, so the servants were the pest control. You'll also notice that the faces have been knocked off of these images. That was also something that probably happened in the period of the Greeks. When Alexander took over the world, the ancient world of Mesopotamia, they often defaced the images of previous emperors. So we don't actually have a face here. We have everything but his face has been destroyed. And this is from the Hall of 100 Columns that is in Persepolis. One of the phrases that you find repeatedly in chapter 7 and 8 of the book of Ezra is this phrase, "The gracious hand of our God was upon us." This is stated several times. The gracious hand of God was upon us. In organizing this group to come back, the register of families in Ezra's group seems to have been very closely connected with the families that came back earlier with Zerubbabel. For one thing, if you read the list in chapter 8 of Ezra, you'll find that the family names are almost identical as the names that you find back in chapter 2 of Ezra. So it seems that many of the people who come in this second wave of people to Jerusalem are probably relatives of people who went in the first wave. They seem to have the same name, and you'll find some of those same names in the book of 1 Esdras as well. When he's looking through his list of people that are going to go in this second wave to Jerusalem, Ezra discovers a problem. There are no Levites present. No, any Levites have volunteered to come to serve in the temple. Well, he wants Levites to come because he wants them to come back to the second temple so they can serve there. And so it took him some extra time to recruit some Levites. And in all, he got a little bit more than a couple of hundred to volunteer to come with him. And so now his group is complete. He's got Levites along with all of the other people, and they're headed back to Jerusalem. As a sign of his trust in God, Ezra did not ask for a military escort. He probably could have asked for that. In fact, later, when Nehemiah comes, he's going to come with Persian cavalry. But Ezra doesn't ask for this. He decides, as a sign of his trust in God, he will go without a military escort, and he will trust that God will give them a successful trip. And in fact, in the end, it was successful. They finally arrived in Jerusalem. They offered sacrifice as a sign of their thanksgiving to God, and they have made it safely. And now Ezra himself is a leader in Jerusalem. One of the first things he discovers when he arrives is that there is a problem with mixed marriages. And by mixed marriages, we mean marriages between Jews and non-Jews, Jews and pagans. Ezra's mission is to teach the Torah. And of course, the Torah is very clear. The people of Israel are not to intermarry with the pagans because of their religious practices. And so soon after Ezra arrives and begins to teach the Torah, his teaching ministry begins to produce repentance on the part of those leaders who have seen this happening in their own community. And at issue was this requirement in the Torah for purity in racial marriage, or purity in marriage, so that there is not interracial marriage. You'll find those passages both in the book of Exodus as well as the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I want to make something clear. The issue of intermarriage or mixed marriage is not purely an ethnic issue, but it is essentially a religious issue. And the reason we know that is because there certainly were people of other races involved with the people of Israel who were accepted as Israelites because they had accepted the faith of Israel. One of the best examples of that is way back in the time of the Exodus, when there was a group called a mixed multitude, a mixed group that came out of Egypt with the Israelites in the Exodus. And even though they were not native Israelites in the sense of having a bloodline back to Abraham, they were Egyptian, nonetheless, they were included in the people of God so long as they accepted the faith of Israel. Another really good personal example is in the little book of Ruth, in which Ruth was a pagan. She was a Moabite, but when she accepted the faith of her mother-in-law Naomi and came back into the land of Israel, she is accepted as a true Israelite, even though her pedigree does not go back to Abraham. In fact, Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of David, no less, and is in the genealogy of Jesus himself. So the issue here in Ezra is not purely a racial issue. It is fundamentally a religious issue. What God intends is that his people do not intermarry with pagans, because the pagan religion will then become mixed with the pure faith of Yahweh and will distort the faith of the believers. So initially, at least, the community leaders have seen this, and they've listened to Ezra preach, and they report that the people and the priests and Levites, a lot of them are in this problem of intermarriage with pagans. And so they need to correct this. And so if Malachi's oracles are from about this same period of time, and as I mentioned earlier, we think that they probably are, Malachi also addresses some of this in his book. And he seems to suggest that some of the Jewish men had divorced their Jewish wives so they could marry non-Jewish women. Well, that's even worse. It's bad enough to marry a pagan, but to get rid of your own Jewish wife in order to marry a pagan, that seems to be a problem. And so this is the situation that Ezra finds himself in when he comes back to Jerusalem. What is he going to do? Well, he's not simply going to bark at them and tell them how bad they are, but he is going to find solidarity with the people and publicly confess this sin as though he himself were part of it. And if you look at Ezra chapter 9 and Ezra's great prayer of repentance, he uses the first person plurals we in his prayer. So he identifies himself with the people. He doesn't say, you bad people did this. He says, we have done this. And he comes at this from the standpoint of a leader in the community, someone who is identifying with the whole community. And so Ezra begins this public prayer of confession, of violation of the Torah that God gave to Moses. And he prays that this has endangered the whole community with paganism. They may in fact lose their faith in Yahweh. And this was the problem that happened before the exile, was the mixing of religion between pagan ideas and the ideas that come from God through Moses. So Ezra's public confession draws quite a crowd. One of the family leaders has returned with Ezra, encourages Ezra to take leadership, says we need to fix this. We need to make amends for this problem. And so what they decided to do was they mandated a gathering in front of the completed temple that had been completed about a half a century earlier. And they agreed then to put away their foreign wives or their pagan wives and offer sacrifice for their sins. Well, the day that they started to do this, as you might think it would happen that way, it started raining, and it started raining hard. It was the rainy season, and they're standing out there in the rain, they're wet, they're miserable, they're trying to figure out what to do about this problem. And so they decide to do it in stages, and in fact it's going to take them a couple of months. Because at any time you put away your wife under the law of Moses, you would have to do this with a certificate of divorce, as is described in Deuteronomy 24. So this would be an involved process and a legal process that the priests would be involved in writing these documents. So this is going to take a couple of months before they get it all worked out. But at least they started, and they kept working it out group by group until they finally had it complete. Now, there's one more really important idea that you need to note here, and it is connected to a word that is called remnant. I think I've used that word previously in the lecture, but a remnant is a piece that is left over. And this group of people that have come back from Babylon to Jerusalem, they are the piece that is left over. If you are familiar with the oracles of Ezekiel, you may remember that Ezekiel shaved his head and his beard, and the hair represented the people. Some of the hair he burned, which represented those who were burned in the destruction of Jerusalem. Some of the hair he chopped up with his sword, which represents those who were killed during the invasion of Jerusalem. Some of the hair he scattered to the winds, which represents those refugees that fled the area and were able to maybe get away. And some of the hair he stuck in his belt as a symbol of the remnant. These few scattered people that were left over, that were not killed, this becomes the nucleus of the people of God. Now, the idea of remnant goes back very early in the history of Israel. It starts at Kadesh, way back in the books of the Law of Moses, in which the Israelites were supposed to invade the land of Canaan. You remember they sent in 12 spies, and 10 of the spies came back with very negative report, and the people rebelled against the Lord and refused to go in. Well, at that point, God sentences them to death. They are going to die in the desert. They will not ever make it to the land of Canaan. All of those who were more than 20 years old are sentenced to death in the land of the wilderness. And this is the first occasion where you have the idea of remnant left over of Israel. The remnant that is left over is the remnant that is alive that will go into the land of Canaan. But the others will all die in the wilderness. So at Kadesh, the first generation rebelled against Yahweh's promise, and after that, the result of the sentence of death means that the second generation is now the remnant that will inherit the promise. The second generation then is those who are left over, and it continues on through the history of Israel. When the northern kingdom of Israel went into exile to Assyria, Judah becomes the remnant because they're the piece that's left. They're the ones who are left over. And then when Judah is exiled to Babylon, it is the exiles who become the remnant, not the people who were left in Jerusalem, but those who actually went to Babylon. They become the remnant. Now they've come from Babylon back to Jerusalem, and it is those returned exiles to Jerusalem who become the remnant. As you continue to read in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and particularly in the books of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, this language of remnant becomes quite prominent because it describes this group that is left over. This is the nucleus of the people of God, the nucleus of the people of Israel that are now the ones through whom God's ancient promises will ultimately be fulfilled. So that brings us to the end of the book of Ezra. In our next lecture, we will be looking at the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is the third wave who will come into the land of Jerusalem and Judah.